Okay, so it's my very good pleasure to welcome back Curtis Dozier, who received his PhD in classics from the University of California, Berkeley in 2008 and has taught at Vassar College in the Hudson Valley of New York State since then. He's an internationally recognized expert on how extremists and hate groups invoke Greco-Roman antiquity to promote their politics. He has documented examples of such appropriations since 2017 at his award-winning website, Pharos, doing justice to the classics, pharos.vassarspaces.net, and has recently published the first book-length treatment of the phenomenon, The White Pedestal, How White Nationalists Use Ancient Greece and Rome to Justify Hate with Yale University Press, 2026, January 6th, 2026. He has appeared on Public Radio's Academic Minute, BBC Radio 4's Antisocial, KPFA's Against the Grain, The Karen Hunter Show, and most recently the podcast This Guy Sucked, talking about Pericles. He has also published a series of articles that outline a new interpretation of the work of the Roman rhetorician Quintilian, whose first century CE treatise on oratory he reads not only as a mere repository of information, but as a literary work, indeed an oratorical performance in its own right. And it's my pleasure now to bring on stage Curtis Dozier with a paper entitled What Our Ancestors Cared About, a mini-memoir of white supremacist classicism. Take it away, Curtis.
Thanks, Hannah. This webinar format doesn't let me use the heart emoji, but I wanted to for your generous introduction. And it's great to be back here at Raised Difficulties. I'm sorry I missed the talks in the middle of the day. I'm at Camwis in Alabama right now, and there was a trip to the Africatown Museum locally, which is the historic community of survivors of the last ship bringing enslaved Africans to the United States, who after emancipation created a community outside of Mobile and lived there for many years. There's a great museum there. So I really wanted to do that. So I missed the middle of the conference, and I will catch the papers on the YouTube channel later. And I regret missing all of them, but it actually sounds like there were elements of memoir in the last session, which I unfortunately missed. So I look forward to seeing those and thinking about whatever intersections there are between what I'm trying to do here today and what you heard then. Although I have a hunch that I'm doing something kind of opposite in a way, because what I'm doing in my talk today is I'm going to try to invert. There's something perverse about this, I admit. The focus of this conference on exclusion in classics to think a little bit more critically about what classics includes, using as my case study my own acculturation into the field. And on this first slide, I have this photo as a kind of window onto that acculturation. Here I am, second from the left, a student in the American School of Classical Studies in Athens summer program, about to reenact the foot race on the track at the site of the Nemean Games. It was really fun. I still remember how fun it was. And there's a part of me that thinks everyone who's interested in the ancient world should have a chance to run the foot race at Nemea under the brilliant Mediterranean sun like I did. But this photo epitomizes so much about my orientation to the ancient world as a student of it, especially the kind of carefree identification of the self with the ancient competitors and the value we placed on, for example, recreating a historically accurate starting posture based on vase paintings showing runners lining up with arms outstretched. That's why we're in that pose. And I remember my confidence on the line that I was going to win the race in the knowledge of the time I had put in at the gym, not to say the gymnasion, over the previous year. And in my memory, in fact, I did win. That's what I remember. And there's a whole theory of why one should study ancient Greece and Rome in that act of reenactment and that memory of it. The title of my talk comes from a New York Times interview with Jeremy Tate, the founder of the classic learning test. um, which markets itself as an alternative to the SAT and ACT, and which is now accepted at all public universities in Florida, as well as the nation's military academies and many other institutions of less prominence. Incidentally, there's not much classical about this test. It's pretty clear the classics are just a brand for it. But this is also the brand, in a sense, that I had bought into when I visited Nemea in 2005. I never consciously thought of the ancient Greeks or Romans as my ancestors, but the desire to recreate the race, arm position and all, is at least adjacent to that idea. If they, the ancient Greeks, if they cared about running the foot race, well, then I care about running this foot race. And another part of this brand, as Tate explains, is that this period of history is, as he puts it, inherently less political. And I think my enjoyment of the race required my viewing it as being apolitical. It's more fun to run the race if you're not thinking about the political background to these competitions, in which elite men display the fruits of the leisure that enslaved or indentured labor provided them. And it's more fun to win if you don't make the link to being able to train as a result of being a student in an unhurried, well-funded graduate program that, in fact, was paying for me to be in Greece in the first place. And if we go back to the photo, to my left is, your left, as you look at the photo, that's Christy, a high school Latin teacher who was on the program too. She might have had a different orientation to this kind of race, which she wouldn't even have been allowed to watch in the classical period, let alone compete in. But at that point in my life, fourth year graduate student who had mostly taken courses on Greek and Latin literature and very little civ, as we would say, because you take language classes if you're serious. As a student with that kind of background, no one had ever explained that historical context to me, or at least I had never learned it. Now, I think it's reasonable to ask, should you listen to a white man relive his glory days at a conference that's dedicated to expanding perspectives on the ancient world? And perhaps Ibram Kendi's remark that the heartbeat of anti-racism is confession is justification enough. But I'd like to go a little further. For the past 7 years, as Hannah said, I've been documenting appropriations of Greco-Roman antiquity by hate groups. And just this year, I've published The White Pedestal. And I've got a little discount code for you here from the SCS in January. It's probably good for another month or two, if that's something that interests you. Actually, there's an audio book coming out pretty soon at the end of this month. Anyway, as I write in this book, when I started working on this material, I believed it was my job as a scholar to correct the distortions and point out the lies that I believed white nationalists needed to deploy to make Greco-Roman antiquity fit their hateful politics. But the more I worked on this material, the more I recognized myself and my own acculturation, both as an American man and as a classical scholar in the material I was studying. And as I've been promoting my book, I've met some people who express skepticism that I could have been that ignorant of the political entanglements of Greco-Roman antiquity until I started to work on white nationalism and classics. So today what I want to do is I'm going to share some of the moments I had while reading that material, while reading overtly white nationalist publications that caused me to reflect on my acculturation. And my larger goal is to try to reveal some of the mechanisms by which these attitudes toward the ancient world perpetuate themselves in utterly ordinary contexts, far from the right-wing echo chambers that we associate with the spread of such ideas about antiquity. I'll start with my very first memory of my acculturation in classics, the reaction of my mother when I told her I was going to take Latin in high school. I remember where we were standing in the house, right in front of the refrigerator, and I was happy she was proud of me. That's probably why I can remember this moment. I was probably about 14 years old. And you can tell from her remark about the Odyssey, I hope you're laughing, that she didn't really understand what I was planning to do, and neither did I in any conscious way. But the fact that the Odyssey is written in Greek and not in Latin, which is what I was going to start taking, that's kind of beside the point. Although I'm somewhat reminded of Elon Musk recommending the Iliad with a picture of the Odyssey. What's significant to Mom were the symbolic elitist associations of Greco-Roman antiquity. And those, by extension, became significant to me. And this is before I ever even set foot in the classics classroom. And I include this vignette because although many of the experiences I'll describe are specific to my identity as a white man, I suspect that many of us, from whatever background, have heard this messaging at one time in our lives about our decision to pursue classics. And as I argue in the book, the respectability of Greco-Roman antiquity is fundamental to its attraction for white nationalist activists. This respectability sanitizes the white nationalist ideas that appear in authentic ancient texts and that are reflected in authentic ancient political practices, and contributes to those ideas appearing traditional, respectable, desirable, maybe even inevitable. And 14-year-old me wasn't thinking about the implications of this. As I said, at that point, I didn't even know what text I'd be able to read in the language I was planning to study, let alone what those texts might authorize. I think the first time I started thinking about the way my life had intersected with white nationalist classicism came when I was visiting the region where my undergraduate institution, Dartmouth College, is located. And I happened to see an article in the local newspaper about the removal of some, as it put it, racially insensitive murals from campus. I had graduated 18 years earlier, and I knew that some of the traditions of old Dartmouth, as we called it, had been modified or abandoned for related reasons. But the existence of such murals on campus was news to me. Reading the article, I learned that there was a dining room downstairs in the main dining hall. This downstairs dining room was known as the Hovey Grill, that was decorated with murals showing derogatory images of the Native Americans whom Dartmouth had ostensibly been founded to educate, although only 20 graduated in the first 200 years of the college's existence. In those murals, the Native American women are sexualized and the men are portrayed as drunken savages. And at this time, I had been publishing Pharos for about a year, and I was still looking for material. So I decided to look into the murals a bit more, and I found, and at that point, it still surprised me when this would happen, I found that there was a classics connection. For one thing, the murals were divided, as it were, by columns dedicated to the different departments of the college at the time that they were painted, and the one that was symbolically first in the series of columns was dedicated to, wait for it, the Department of Classics. And furthermore, one of the ways the murals represent the Native Americans as intellectually inferior is by showing one of the women attempting to read a Latin textbook and holding it upside down. This experience would become much more common as I continue my research. Some artifact of white supremacy would come across my desk, and more often than not, classics would be there if you looked for it. But at this time, that was a little bit of a surprise to me. So I wrote it up for Pharos, and I think it was the first time I had considered the racism against Indigenous people on the site. But today, in this talk, I want to highlight my lack of familiarity with these murals, even though I had spent 4 years of my life on that campus at Dartmouth. And in fact, I'd eaten 3 or more meals per day in the building where these murals were located throughout that 4-year period. The murals were downstairs, as I said, from the main dining hall. And as I read about them, I remembered that there was a stairway leading downstairs in the main entrance of the building, which was always roped off. And I had walked by those stairs every single day, never once asking, or I think even wondering, what's down there. And over time, I've come to see these murals and their location on campus as a kind of metaphor for my lack of understanding of the politics of classics. I attended classes in classics in Reed Hall, which is a whitewashed building, literally sitting among the original structures of Dartmouth College and sitting atop a hill overlooking Dartmouth's historic green, as we call it, the quad. And directly across that green from Reed Hall was Thayer Hall, the dining hall, in whose basement the murals were located. That is, we studied ancient Greek and Latin atop a symbolically significant hill less than 500 meters away from a place where an artifact of the white supremacist history of classics was literally locked and unmentioned in a dark basement. I actually wonder how many of my professors even knew the murals were there. I'm confident that none of them knew about the reference to the Department of Classics in the murals or the classical elements in its portrayal of Indigenous people. So I highlight here how the silence And the diverted gaze combined with my complacency as I walked daily by the stairwell kind of conspired to preserve my innocence of this dimension of the material I was studying. I'll mention one other close encounter or near miss, this time one where my complacency may actually have saved me from becoming more politically aware that I would now regret. I spent the summer following my junior year of college in Rome, where I fell madly in love with a woman from another university in my program. And we spent a lot of time together that summer. And I remember one time we stopped by the Trastevere apartment that she shared with two other women who were also in the program. And I was sitting on the couch, and one of them, not my love interest, but the woman who was kind of our ringleader, she pointed out to me a book that she had brought with her from Rome. And in my mind's eye, I can still see the gold lettering of its cover glittering in the dusky evening light like some eldritch tome of forbidden lore. And indeed, it was an eldritch tome of forbidden lore. It was Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, a work which years later, working on research for my book, I would learn was regarded by contemporary white nationalists as a foundational text for their movement, for its ascription of a uniquely dynamic, creative, and energetic nature to Europe. You should read this, Curtis, she told me. I never did. But as a kid from suburban Colorado, experiencing independence in Europe for the first time, I looked up to her so much for her worldly familiarity with Rome and Italy. And over the years that followed, even after things didn't work out between me and this woman's roommate, I kept that book in mind as something I probably should read. And I'm now haunted by the casual way a peer recommended this book to me. How this book was evidently significant enough to her to be carried all the way to Rome. And I've wondered how she knew about it, who had recommended it to her, and why. And years later, I reconnected with this person, now a professional colleague. And she was supportive of my work on white nationalism and classics. And I didn't detect any whiff of reactionary politics in the way she talked to me about that. And I didn't ask her about the admiration she expressed for Spengler that summer last century when, let's be honest, we were just kids. I'm confident she wouldn't recommend it to me today, but its presence in that room where two future professors shared a youthful enthusiasm for antiquity, I think it shows how close by these ideas can be when classicists gather. I'm relating these vignettes in the order I reflected on them, not in the order they happened. So I encountered highbrow white nationalism's fascination with Spengler relatively early in my research because references to him are so pervasive. But it wasn't long before I began to see my actual path, not just the one I almost took, reflected in the material I found in their publications. I came across an article arguing for the importance of Greek myths to white identity in the white nationalist publication, The Occidental Observer. It was an article written by Tomislav Sunic, who holds a PhD in political science from UC Davis and who's translated a number of important works of European white nationalist thought into English. As you can see, he's writing about Heracles as a model for young white males. I couldn't relate to that. I never looked up to Hercules. But Sunic's assumption that white men should identify with Apollo hit me harder. Bernini's sculpture of Apollo and Daphne, which I show there, had been integral to my desire to study classics. When I had studied in Rome with the Dartmouth Classics Department, our program had paired a visit to the Vatican museums to see the Laocoon group with a visit to the Galleria Borghese to see this sculpture because, my professor argued, Bernini's sculpture refuted or at least complicated the distinction between poetry and sculpture that Gottfried Lessing had argued for in his book Laocoon. That little summary in 2026 against the background of this talk can't really capture the intellectual exhilaration of this exercise that I experienced, which really converted me from a classics dabbler to a classics major. And I think part of this exhilaration was the fact that Bernini's sculpture represented for me the significance of the classical tradition for the highbrow, educated, as my mom might have said, world that I so desperately wanted to be a part of. No one that I remember, at least, ever pointed out to me that Bernini's sculpture portrayed a rape. Not even a friend in the program. A woman who had attended the same lecture and who, in fact, encouraged me to think of myself as Apollo, treating the sculpture as a metaphor for intellectual striving. And that's actually an identification I returned to many times over the ensuing years, especially amid the struggles of graduate school. And it was not until my honeymoon in Italy, years later, when I took my wife to see this sculpture that had inspired me so much, that I saw this sculpture for what it was. Actually, I didn't see it for what it was, but she took one look at it and she said to me, "That's a rape." And I write about this a little in my book. I met that remark then with defensiveness, but eventually we never spoke of it again. I saw what she meant. And in some sense, that intervention was a first step toward changing my orientation to the ancient world. In 1997, I returned to campus, however, newly invigorated to immerse myself in the study of Greco-Roman antiquity. I started learning Greek, I declared a major, and just generally did all the things that we wish our students would do. So the next summer, I placed my first order with a then relatively new website called Amazon.com. This is 1998. I think it was founded in 1994. My first book, the book I ordered, was Who Killed Homer? The Demise of Classical Education and the Recovery of Greek Wisdom. I've got a picture of my order there for you. This book had been recommended to me by the same fellow student who encouraged my identification with Apollo. If you want to be a classics professor, she told me, you need to read this book. Just like that woman in Rome, I looked up to her for her worldly sophistication. She was from New York City. She read the New York Times Book Review. That's probably where she learned about this. She kept up with serious topics, and she just basically epitomized for me how you didn't have to wait to be a professor to have a rich intellectual life like the one I was hoping to have. So I did what she said. I got the book and I read it cover to cover. And as strange as it may sound to you that I could look at Apollo and Daphne without recognizing the sexual violence integral to the portrayal, it will be even stranger that I did not recognize this book as a political manifesto. What I remember experiencing it as was a historical introduction to Greek culture, the kind I hadn't had because almost all my courses up until then had been Greek and Latin language courses. The part I actually remember most vividly is the long appendix in which Victor David Hansen lays out what he thinks are the key texts for the study of classical antiquity, including the Old Oligarch, who Hansen praises for being far more honest than most on the right today in declaring candidly that to the gifted alone should go the spoils, and that among the mob there is the greatest ignorance, disorder, and amorality. The screeds in the book against Paige Dubois, against Barbara Goff, and many other scholars, most of them women, they made less of an impression on me because I knew nothing about classical studies outside my own institution. And that in itself is not that surprising or necessarily even blameworthy. I was, after all, only a junior in college. But it was at least partly a reflex of my attitude that what I was engaged in was the unmediated study of ancient literature in the original languages, a project I undertook without any grounding in the socioeconomic history that reading Dubois might have afforded me, or the critical reception context that reading Goff might have. And I don't remember when I realized what Victor Davis Hansen stood for. I think his increased profile following the 9/11 attacks probably brought that into focus for me. But I thought of his attacks on feminist and other theoretically engaged scholarship when I read an essay in the premier journal of academic white nationalism, the Occidental Quarterly, that criticized women's studies programs and compared them unfavorably to the study of ancient Greek. This was, in fact, Hansen's refrain about feminist classics, that they weren't really studying the ancient Greeks at all, but were simply exercises in narcissism, which I suppose on some level I agreed with when I originally read the book. The following fall, I actually started reading Homer in ancient Greek, not because, I'm relieved to say, Hansen had told me to, but because that was the course offered for students who had completed the introductory and intermediate levels of that language. We read a lot of Greek, of course, but the class also devoted time to the Homeric question and ancient contexts in which Homeric epics were composed. One of those sessions came rushing back to me, and not in a good way, when I read an essay by Samuel T. Francis, another PhD in political science, who had been called the philosopher king of the radical right, and who started writing for the white supremacist magazine American Renaissance after he was fired from the Washington Times newspaper. And in this essay, Francis is trying to delineate the unique qualities that make white people superior by turning to ancient history for evidence. Here I reproduce one of his claims, namely that you can tell that white people are superior because their mythological stories contain so much more depth and emotional range than what he calls the thin tales of Egypt and Babylonia. This was precisely the point that my professor made to us in that Homer seminar in the session he devoted to Near Eastern influence on the Homeric epics. A memory made doubly disturbing by the realization that the seminar in 1998 and Francis's essay published in 1996 were roughly contemporary. I don't mean that my professor had read the essay. I am sure he was no more aware of American Renaissance than he was of the classical content in the murals of the Hovey Grill. But it's chilling to see the same ideas in an Ivy League classroom as in the work of a notorious white nationalist intellectual. I know I'm running up on time here, but I'll wrap up with my last remarks because I want to say one more thing about that seminar on Homer. I don't have my notes from that class, still less a transcript of the professor's remarks. I say that he taught us that the Epic of Gilgamesh lacked the emotional range and depth of the Homeric epics, but it'd be more accurate to say that I learned this about the Epic of Gilgamesh. I have to admit, I don't know what my professor was trying to teach me that day. I only know what I learned. And I don't know how much of that came from what he told us and how much of it came from whatever I already believed. Perhaps under the influence of Hansen, perhaps under the influence of my peers, perhaps just under the influence of the triumphalist narratives of Western civilization that I grew up with as a child in the final years of the Cold War. But it doesn't really matter what he intended for me to learn, because I'm not here to talk about my teachers and what a poor job they did with my education. Sure, they didn't know about the murals, but these were not, for the most part, politically reactionary people. The professor who introduced me to Apollo and Daphne was Jim Tatum. He was a gay man who, as I wrote in a reminiscence about him after his death last month, he scolded me for my ignorance of why he might choose to live in the LGBTQ-friendly state of Vermont and not in New Hampshire. And he was the author of a pioneering work on African-American classicism, which he co-wrote with a Black colleague in the Dartmouth English department. It seems impossible to believe he didn't point out the sexual violence of the sculpture when he showed it to me. But if he did, it didn't register with me. And I can multiply those stories across my time. I think I had every opportunity to learn something critical about the ancient world, and I didn't, because somehow the ideas I had about the ancient world, about what it was and why we might study it, were stronger than what they must have been telling me. Now, I recognize all this took place a long time ago in a media landscape almost unrecognizable in 2026, no social media. The idea of the influencer was unknown. American Renaissance was still a print publication, and I probably couldn't have gotten a copy even if I had known it existed. We didn't even have cell phones. But even so, these regressive and violent ideas reached me. Think about how much easier it is for them to reach us now. And yet it feels like a difference of degree and not of kind to me. These ideas reached me relationally, through the recommendations of my friends. My girlfriend's roommate told me to read Spengler. My fellow classics major told me to read Victor Davis Hanson. These are shared in 1990s terms. They're retweets, maybe they're likes. The algorithms are based in part on what others it deems similar to you have engaged with. It's so much easier to be exposed to these ideas now, but the mechanisms, I think, are fundamentally similar. So the value of taking white nationalist classism seriously, I think, is the provocation it provides to sort of trouble the comfort so many of us are acculturated to have with these ideas. But I want to finally reflect that the only reason I reached the point where I was ready to experience that provocation was that my peers had begun to challenge those comfortable certainties. Indeed, when I proposed this topic, I had not quite grasped for this conference, I had not quite grasped how the company you keep, so to say, would emerge as a theme of these reminiscences. I have been the beneficiary of many friendships within classics with people who gently and with love had invited me to see both the ancient world more fully and who had shared with me their own experiences of alienation from classical material, all the ways they did not, could not want to run the race at Nemea. What stands out to me when I think about the people who've shaped my outlook the most is how each of them was in some way excluded by canonical ancient evidence and or the field as it's traditionally constituted, as a woman, as a Jewish person, a gay person, an outsider of one kind or another. And as I write in the acknowledgments to my book, the white nationalists profiled in this book fear relationships such as these because friendship across difference has such power to open minds and change hearts. So if we take one thing away from this mini memoir, as I've called it, let it be this call to strive to make friendship across difference an integral part of our disciplinary communities. To the truth that diversity and access is necessary to right historical wrongs, I want to add that it is essential to the evolution of our field, because even more than critical pedagogy, even more than writing books like mine, it has such potential to decenter and destabilize the entrenched narratives that we must abandon if the discipline is to be reformed. Thank you.